Okay, I think this whole adult ed mod started back in February. Our Earth Stewards group, focus, which was formerly the sustainability group, was looking for topics related to climate change. And as I was driving, I heard on Carrie Miller, a woman who was speaking on talking to children about climate change. I said, oh, that was a really interesting topic. Her name was Mary Demeter. She wrote a really excellent book called Climate Revolution, A Parent Guide to Climate Revolution. I highly recommend it. So I called around and because she lived out in Seattle, she wasn't able to come to St. Luke, but then I got the name Kathy Jordan. So I looked up Kathy Jordan, said Kathy Jordan, PhD Associate Director for Leadership and Education in the Institute on the Environment, Professor of Pediatrics, and Counseling Research Director for the Children's Nature Network. And I said, oh, wow, I hope she will come. And I called and she said, yes, she would. Well, then came COVID and we shut down and we postponed in summer, and then our anti-racism focus. So it kind of got put in the back burner. But now with the advent of these really climactic things that have happened with the fires and the hurricane and probably some fire risks at our border with Canada, we are, this is on the front burner again, and it is inextricably bound, I should say, to both these other topics of COVID and the anti-racism. So one more thing I wanted to say, I was reading the National Wildlife magazine and I came across an article by Richard Louv, who wrote the landmark book, Last Child in the Woods, which we used as a foundation for our creative arts and nature camp. In it, I was reading and I was just excited because I saw founder Ming Koa of the Children's Nature Network, Michael Barnes and Kathy Jordan published a systemic review of nature-related education research in the journal Frontiers in Psychology. So it'll be very interesting to hear some of your findings. And so thank you, and we're honored to have you, Kathy Jordan. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again now. Okay, now you should just be seeing a title slide. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. And thanks for putting yourself on mute, everyone. That, I think, helps everybody's audio. So, you know, stories of climate change, as well as so many things in our society, actually pretty much everything, I think, are really stories about systems, whether it be COVID or civil unrest, homelessness, immigration. And many of those systems are interrelated. They're systems in and of themselves, and they're related to each other as well. So I'm going to set the stage for how to talk to kids about climate change and sort of other vexing problems in our society by introducing the idea of systems thinking. Most of my talk will be about how we talk to kids about climate change, and then I'm going to return to this idea of systems thinking and talk a little bit about how we might leverage the fact that an acute pandemic is happening in the context of a chronic environmental crisis to help young people understand how these two things, and actually many other things, are connected in a system, because understanding these interactions, I think, can help them make sense of the world, increase their confidence in adapting and finding solutions to things like climate change. You'll also hear me talk about my passion about connecting children to nature. I'm going to touch only briefly on that in this presentation, but I'm really happy to talk about that later, talk about my work with the Children in Nature Network later if you'd like, talk about any of that research on why nature is good for kids and why those benefits are particularly important in this specific period of time when we're dealing with both climate change and also a pandemic that is just, you know, resulting in massive chaos in our lives, and particularly for kids with things like school closures and adapting to learning online, etc. I have put a link in the chat box to a Google Doc that hopefully you will have access to. And if it says, you know, request access, I will grant your requests after the talk, but it is essentially a set of notes and resources and links to things about talking to kids about climate change. So I'm going to, talk about a lot of things. My slides are not a lot of words, but don't feel like you need to take notes because you're going to have access to a document later. Nancy, could you go on mute, please? I'm getting a little bit of audio feedback from your channel. Thank you so much. Okay, so, this might be the first time in history that, or at least in the United States, that there are children wondering whether they are going to have a future, whether they should have children as a result of the potential for climate change to get worse and worse. This quote illustrates the level of concern that youth and young adults have about the world right now, and I find that a little scary because there is evidence to be concerned about in terms of how climate change is affecting young people as well as young children. Youth are worried, they're angry, they're experiencing anxiety, phobias, depression, sleep disorders. Some are experiencing trauma from things like storms and floods and fires. Okay. Could someone figure out who that is and please mute their channel? Thank you so much.
Kathy, quick note, we may have some folks join late and I'll try to keep, I can mute them as the host, so I'll try to keep an eye and get them as they come in.
Thank you so much, thank you. So some kids are actually experiencing trauma, from things like storms and floods and fires, and that can result in PTSD. Kids who have experienced those sorts of traumas, particularly if it disrupts the family functioning, or maybe for some reason they lose a family member or become separated from them, it can lead to attachment disorders and substance abuse as a way of coping with those stressors. So climate impacts can lead to later or longer term problems as well, just over time, developing difficulty with emotional regulation, cognitive development issues, learning problems, behavioral challenges, issues in language development, academic performance challenges, and just sort of a predisposition or a risk factor for adult mental health outcomes. So with that context, I don't mean to sort of start on a real downer, but just to kind of communicate that this is really an important health and mental health as well as ecological issue. But I actually have a lot of hope, and I hope by the end I communicate that there are some things that I am actually quite hopeful for. But now I want to dig in a little bit and set the stage for how systems thinking can help young people make sense of these multiple bad things that are happening to us all at once, namely climate change and the pandemic are what I'm going to focus on. The important thing is to help kids realize that these things are all connected. They are all part of a system. Systems thinking is this idea that phenomena in the world relate to each other in complex ways. It's like a big spider web. If you wiggle, you wiggle one thread in the web on one side, it's going to cause some, perturbation on the other side or disruption on the other side of the web. It's going to cause some disruption in the system such that the whole system is affected. People use systems thinking to solve problems, but there's also this, like systems thinking is this actual thing that you can learn how to do. But there's also a mindset, being a systems thinker, that I think is really important to encourage in our young people. So what are the characteristics of a systems thinker? A systems thinker is someone who seeks to understand the big picture, like the forest, rather than just the details or the trees. They observe how elements within a system change over time. They're generating sort of ideas about patterns and trends. A system thinker realizes that to effect change within a system, they have to use knowledge about the system's structure. Systems can produce behaviors and conditions, and accountability should be on the system. They need to understand that systems are typically the reason for bad things happening, not any one individual. They can identify interdependencies. They can take and change perspectives, see other people's points of view, see other parts of the system that maybe aren't particularly affecting them at the moment. They understand, or they surface and then they test assumptions. They're sort of mini scientists. They consider an issue fully before deciding on an action. They don't jump to conclusions or jump to action. They use understanding of system structures to find leverage points. You know, they think strategically. What's happening in the system? Where can I most strategically or effectively intervene? They consider short-term and long-term consequences of actions. They look for or try to anticipate the unintended consequences, not just the intended consequences. And then they're sort of like evaluators. They monitor, evaluate, and then they change course of action as needed. So those are the kinds of cognitive styles and ways of thinking and being in the world that we want to encourage in our young people. So I'm going to leave that for a second and turn now to how to actually talk to kids about climate change. And then I'm going to come back to that systems thinking idea again at the end. So I think it's really important to be thinking about what kids really need to know and what might be too much information. How to talk to them in developmentally appropriate ways, and consider how our children and youth are dealing with this, you know, all of this that's happening right now in an emotional, you know, sort of way. So first, I'm interested to know what you're hearing from children and teens. What are they asking about? What are they talking about? If you would use the chat while I dive into some tips about talking to kids, we can come back and look at your ideas in the chat later. I actually don't have access to the chat right now as I'm presenting, but we'll kind of come back and look at that later. But go ahead and use that chat function to kind of talk to each other a little bit about what you know about the kids in your lives and what they're talking about regarding climate change. So in responding to questions and addressing climate change, I think the first thing is to figure out, what are they really asking? Do they mostly want information, or do they mostly want reassurance? One is about problem or solution focused coping, a need for information, and the other is about emotion focused coping. The older the child, the more you can focus on the problem and solutions, but you always have to attend to the emotional concern as well. So giving information, if that's what really feels like that's what the child wants, they want to know something about, you know, why this is happening, or, that they just want to understand. Giving information to a young child is about developmental appropriateness. So I've given this example. Humans are burning lots and lots of fossil fuels like coal for energy in planes and in cars to light our houses. And that's putting gases in the air that trap heat. It's like a blanket wrapped around the planet, keeping it warm. A hotter planet means we get bigger storms. It means that icebergs melt and oceans will rise. It makes it harder for animals to find places to live. It's a really big problem, but there are a lot of smart people working hard on it. And there's also lots we can do as a family to help. So I want to dissect that message just, for a second. It is giving information about how climate change works. It's talking about gases going into the air that heat up the planet. It's using a metaphor that kids can understand, that idea of wrapping a blanket around the planet to hold in the heat to keep it warm. That idea of melting and oceans rising might tap what they might be, elementary school kids learn about the water cycle and things like that. You might be able to integrate that into your explanation. It also talks about, this is severe, this is significant, but there are people working on this, and it's not something that you need to panic about. And there are things that we can do. And those things are an important message that you're going to see me talk about in slides here coming up in just a minute. So what about giving information to an older child? So here's an explanation that you might use with a middle schooler or an adolescent. When we burn fossil fuels for energy, they release greenhouse gases that that let the warmth of the sun into our atmosphere, but don't let it out. The earth heats up. The water cycle is affected because warmer air holds more moisture and creates heavy rains and floods, which can be dangerous for humans and animals and damage our infrastructure. And the hotter temperatures melt more icebergs, which causes sea levels to rise, which can cause floods and shoreline erosion. But because there are lots of impacts, there are also a lot of ways we can act and make a difference. This is actually exactly the same number of words as I used with the younger child, but it conveys more information in more sort of, with more scientific rigor, I guess I would say. But both message do that thing that's really important, which is they convey hope. It's really important to be solutions focused, hearing about everything that is going wrong without knowing that there are things that we can do as individuals, as a family, as a society. That's going to take an emotional toll. So hopeful message, solutions focused messages are really important. The next really important thing is about validating emotions. No matter how old a child is, you need to assure them that they're not alone in whatever it is that they are feeling. And they may be feeling a whole range of different emotions. All of those emotions are, to be expected and not abnormal. The younger the child is, the more you can assure them that they are going to be taken care of by adults, that adults are, working to make things better. The older they are, adolescents, the less that message resonates, because adolescents, teenagers right now are frankly a little fed up with adult generation, fed up with the politics, the divides, the ways that the last several generations have treated the earth, and they're not going to be reassured about the message that adults are helping and taking care of this. So a different message is needed there, which I'll talk about in a minute. But again, validating those emotions and providing some reassurance is important at every age. The next thing is about instilling hope, which I talked about earlier. This is important. Creating angst or other bad feelings can be both detrimental to mental health, and it can be immobilizing. Then, kids are immobilized, then we miss out on the opportunity to tap their energy and their creativity in this difficult solution. And we really definitely need that. Hope can't be just, I guess, blind optimism, right? You can't just sort of have a Pollyanna, view, oh, it's all going to be okay, that kind of thing. Hope really comes from a combination of factors about, understanding what there is to be hopeful about. Amazing technologies that are happening, people that are doing, amazing work to galvanize, youth movements and that sort of thing. It's also about, understanding their own power. And that's what I want to talk about next, because, nothing's going to improve if we believe that we can't make a difference. So to make a difference, we need a vision about what can change and what's possible. We need to understand how it could change and how we can contribute. And we need to believe that we can make that contribution. That's called efficacy or agency. So taking action needs to be age appropriate. It needs to be meaningful to that child or that youth based on their developmental stage and what's important in their lives and their life context. Typically though, young children, their world is kind of their home and their family structure. So actions might be things that take place in the home or that the family would do together. Elementary school age kids are also focused on home, but they are in school, and the school community and their friend groups and the families of their friends have become important. So that might be sort of the context where change might happen, or where organizing might happen. Middle and high school age kids, still home is important. They may be wanting to make very important changes in their home. They may be asking their families to go vegan, or that sort of thing. They are focused on school, and they're focused on the broader community and national politics and even international or global affairs. They're into advocacy and activism. And here's where I think we can really encourage them to have outlets for their interests, their those strong emotions around frustration or anger or fear, even, and channeling that towards things that they can actually do in these different venues, from home to school to community to national and international levels. The next thing I think is really important is encouraging compassion. Climate change affects different people differently in our own country and around the world. Some of our most vulnerable citizens here and across the world, lower income folks, people of color, disabled, elderly, they're going to be hardest hit. They are being hardest hit when climate change creates something like an extreme weather event or just, rising temperatures. So disadvantaged and vulnerable groups have more physical and mental health issues anyway that put them at risk for complications. They live in more risky environments due to the location or the air quality, housing quality, or amenities like whether or not they have air conditioning. And they have fewer resources to cope, fewer resources to seek assistance, or fewer resources to change their own situation. So if age appropriate, it might be a good thing to place your feedback to kids about climate change, your explanations about climate change in the context of what we know about disparities and inequities that are ubiquitous inequities in our society. Help them understand that there are likely other folks that are experiencing something different and possibly worse than what they know about or what they themselves experience, and that compassion is warranted there. And I've saved this for last, but it's actually, I think, the foundation to helping kids make a difference with respect to climate change. No one is going to care about climate and environmental issues unless they feel a meaningful connection to the natural world, to the environment, to our Earth. That connection can happen at any age, but we certainly have a ripe window of opportunity in childhood to make that connection. To help kids fall in love with nature, essentially. And that sets the stage for everything else that follows in terms of their motivation for taking action to deal with a warming planet. So I want to change gears here a little bit and talk about some intersections between climate and COVID. I'm going to focus on you, the adults, now, and give you information about this linkage rather than really talking really specifically how to talk to kids about this, because I think my advice would really be similar. Figure out what kids are really asking, what they really want to know, give information that's based on their developmental levels and age-appropriate levels, validate their emotions, enhance their sense of self-efficacy, and encourage compassion and understanding of inequities. So here's what I think we all need to know about the relationship between climate change and COVID. So in terms of a direct link, there isn't really good evidence that climate change was a direct cause of the emergence of COVID, but there are a number of ways that these two things intersect because they are part of a system. So first, there's evidence of indirect links. There are, and there are certainly what I would call parallels between COVID and climate change. So one is about land use. Humans have put enormous pressures on nature in the form of deforestation from logging, mining, and from growing crops and raising livestock to feed people and animals. These practices not only contribute to climate change, they alter or destroy habitats. With fewer places to live and less access to food, animals are then pushed into humans' habitats to find food and shelter. And that can lead to diseases in animals jumping to humans when we have increased contact with them. That's called spillover. Then spread is especially likely to happen in densely populated areas like cities where our proximity to each other facilitates transmission. It's possible that land use practices created habitat changes in a village in Asia that placed humans and bats in closer proximity. But we really think that the meat market idea was really an important piece of that it went from bat to pangolin to human. So those land use practices contribute to climate change, and then they contributed to the emergence of COVID. The other indirect link and parallel is related to human health and inequity. Climate and health are inextricably connected. So climate does play a role in the susceptibility of populations to COVID as it spreads. The same people who are most at risk for the effects of climate change, we talked about disadvantaged communities, people of color, elderly, health compromised individuals. These are also the groups that are most at risk for contracting and dying from the virus. This is a good example how inequities in our society compound each other. So how about COVID's influence on climate? Kind of the reverse. So COVID may, experiencing COVID and the shutdown, I will say, may actually have been good for climate change, as it has resulted in a drop, although small, in carbon emissions, cleaner air and water, increases in behaviors that would be considered pro-environmental, such as working from home, less commuting, much less air travel, for example, and an increased interest in the natural environment. But the question is really whether we can or whether we want to sustain these and make those longer term impacts, or if we're going to revert to old ways and erase the environmental gains made during this time. I fear that in some ways we've already started to do that reversal. I want to return to that idea that climate and environmental issues also making those with COVID more sick or more likely to die, because this is a really good example of systems thinking. A good example is air pollution, which results from practices that can lead to warming and ozone depletion. Air pollution causes respiratory problems and can make people more susceptible to infection and more likely to experience complications. Air pollution exposure is also not equitably distributed across demographic groups. Most of us are aware of various ways that, for example, people from low-income backgrounds experience greater health disparities, but we tend to see those somewhat in isolation. We might know that low-income individuals tend to have higher rates of asthma. Low-income individuals tend to have higher rates of obesity. COVID-19 has really laid bare the intricate ways that multiple inequities and disparate outcomes intersect, such that some of us are protected and some of us are in danger. So for example, asthma can be triggered by poor air quality. Air quality can be made worse in low-income communities that lack greenery, trees in particular, that help reduce air pollution, as well as living near industry and traffic, which is more common for low-income families. Obesity in low-income neighborhoods is also partly related to lack of greenery, like access to parks and walkable areas for exercise. Obesity and lack of exercise then exacerbate asthma. People with conditions like asthma and obesity who are exposed to poor air quality are getting sicker and are more likely to die from COVID. Crowded living conditions, which can be more common in low-income communities, place residents at risk for COVID-19 exposure. You're just in close quarters. So we need to see that living conditions, quality of the natural environment, environmental issues like air quality, chronic health issues, the risk of getting COVID-19 and risk of dying from COVID-19 are really intimately connected in ways that create really clear winners and losers. They are all part of a system, and equity and justice are just totally integrated into those systems. Basically, some of the factors that affect climate change do also relate to COVID-19. And I think importantly, there are important overlapping vulnerabilities and inequities in COVID and climate risk, even if we can't say that, climate caused or was a direct, cause of climate change or direct cause of COVID. Okay. So a point that I'm really trying to make here is that it's really important to be a systems thinker and to help kids be systems thinkers and helping them use systems thinking in their everyday lives. The hopeful way of thinking about this, and the thing that I really want young people to understand, is that because things are connected and impacting one thing can change something seemingly unrelated or distant, it's that it works for positive interventions as much as negative disruptions. If we can find ways of making change strategically, using what we know about systems, even if they're relatively small changes, we could have a bigger impact than we actually realize. We need to avoid thinking about things in silos and instead think about them like a spider web, as systems. That is key to being able to think strategically. And it's not just environmental sorts of things that are part of systems. As I said at the beginning, almost everything about living as humans can be thought of in systems, in system thinking terms. being able to think systemically will serve our youth very well as they make all sorts of decisions in their lives. And as they think about their roles as citizens and they make decisions like who they're going to vote for when they're old enough to vote. Understanding of public health, not in a, go get a graduate degree, but generally having sort of a public health lens and systems literacy by candidates and elected officials, I think that should be a litmus test. If someone can articulate how their actions and policies will not just affect one issue or one group right now, but how that action or policy sits in a system, what or who else will be affected and what the long-term consequences are, they're probably going to make better decisions and lead us toward a more sustainable future than someone whose views are in isolation. They only have a short-term view, a short horizon. I think our capacity to teach our kids how to do that kind of systems thinking and how to recognize when their leaders are and are not able to do that, that is something that gives me hope. And so systems thinking is what I really want to encourage here. So I want to ask you, in addition to what you've already perhaps put in the chat, and I'll stop sharing my screen in just a minute and take a look at that. I'm wondering also about what examples of systems you might see in your life or in society. So I'm going to stop sharing now and we can turn to some of your questions and comments. And I want to encourage you to take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask questions or bring up, ideas about where you see systems thinking. But I'm just going to read one question from Brennan, or one comment, I guess. I get very frustrated when folks say of future generations, you're so inspiring, you're going to lead the way on this, whether that's climate change, racism, or other large structural problems. Do you have messaging advice on how to encourage younger leadership while honoring our own responsibility? Is it as simple as you're doing an amazing job and I'm committed to doing my part as well? That, I think, is an incredibly important message. Yes, I think you are right on target there. I think it is really important to honor what youth are doing, to give them as many opportunities to voice their opinions, to take action, feed that spirit, help them, make things happen. But not put all the pressure on them, saying things to them like, you are our future, or, you're going to, your generation has the power to solve this problem. That is really unfair. Their generation did not cause the situation we are in now. And I think really, as adults, taking responsibility for the decisions that we made unknowingly, as often as individuals, knowingly as corporations and governments sometimes, is a really important thing to own up to the younger generation, and committing to this idea of, I'm going to do my part, and I'm going to also hold elected officials and corporations responsible is an important message. One other question from Brennan, and then please do add your own to the chat, or take yourself off mute in just a minute. We have a number of folks here who are in the grandparent stage of life. Do you have any recommendations for those of us who are in grandparent roles, trying to support both grandkids in these conversations, but also our own children, who are parents trying to navigate these conversations? This is a difficult conversation to land only on parents' shoulders, and I find myself wondering if grandparents can be a helpful ally here. I think grandparents are incredibly important. I want to talk about a concept. Nancy, you mentioned Rich Louv and his work. He has talked about something called the Extinction of Experience. And this is the idea that from one generation to the immediate next generation, it doesn't sometimes feel like there's been a huge change. Well, now it's starting to get really obvious in climate change, but maybe a decade or two ago, we were in climate change, but the differences weren't as obvious. The changes that we've made in deforestation or habitat loss are not as obvious one generation to the next, immediate next, and they're often not just in our own children's experiences, what they see right now is all they know, right? So grandparents are incredibly important because you have memories of what playing in nature was like as children. You have experiences seeing what has changed over a number of decades that even your own children, adult children, don't necessarily have that perspective. And we have to battle this idea of extinction of experience. If we don't talk about, without being overly nostalgic and romantic about it, but that we have made drastic changes to the environment, to nature, to our cities, we will forget that there are human influences on all of this. And if we change those things, we can also have the power to change things back to a better way of being. And you have a vision about what that could be. I hope that made sense. Brendan, did that answer your question, or does anybody have another something else to say about that? I think that's really important given your, the demographics of your group. Judy, you have your hand up. I can see you.
Yes, yeah. You answered my question, and I'll just add that I think most of us are probably more comfortable talking directly rather using the chat here. So I'd expect a lot of questions to come here as we open it up.
Let's do it. Okay, Judy.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I understand what you were saying in response to Brennan's comments, that as let's say a grandparent, to explicitly say, when I was a kid, this was happening, and now due to climate change, we've lost that. And then add in the hopeful piece, or what actions we need to take. But really to be quite pointed then in the changes we've seen over our lifetime.
I think that is important, without being dismal, without communicating just, oh, the world is just going to hell in a handbasket, and without, being, I guess, overly nostalgic or overly romanticizing, which sometimes we can be dismissed when we do that. But if we can be very clear about what our observations are about what's different now than over, the last several decades, that is a perspective that even your own adult children don't have. And you can help your own children understand what has changed in your lifetime so that they can also better communicate to their children about what these changes have looked like over time. And basically, you are key to combating this idea of extinction of experience, which is just basically any one generation only knows what's happening in its time as normal and forgets, well, never knew that it looked different, several decades ago. So adding that knowledge, observations over time to the idea of hope, I think is really important. And hope plus that idea of efficacy. And efficacy really is about understanding what can change and believing you have the power to take action. And go ahead and, I can't see all of you because you're on two different screens. So if you have something to say, just hop in and start talking.
This is Skip Messenger. I used to teach at Hamlin, and one of the assignments I used to have was part of an assignment was having students actually interview their grandparents about climate change during their lifetime, and it was pretty interesting for them and enlightening to realize that in fact, yes, here in Minnesota things changed quite a bit, and I had students from all over the state, so that was really quite enlightening for them.
Yeah, you remind me that there's a project at the university called backyard phenology. Phenology is sort of the study of how things change, seasonality and broader timescales as well. And it's a collaboration between an artist and a forestry professor and the Institute on the Environment where I work. And they have a little tiny camper van that they have decked out as a recording studio. And they have taken it to the state fair and around the state, particularly in rural areas where, you know, there's a difference in how climate change is viewed in metropolitan urban areas and in rural areas. And what's interesting about taking a phenology approach is that people who may say that they're not sure about climate change, or they're really not sure about the human influence on climate change, they do know that things have changed. And if you can elicit stories about, particularly from farmers, folks in agriculture, about what has, you know, changed in their practices, how they've had to adapt to different conditions related to rain and storms and heat waves and those sorts of things. They can tell stories, and they, you know, this is the point of the, you know, the recording, you know, mini camper. They will tell stories about phenology that essentially document climate change from their perspective, but, you know, without sort of putting them on the defensive about like, that's climate change. You help them understand that, yeah, yeah, something is actually changing, and it has happened in your lifetime, and it's evident in the ways that you practice your agriculture, or, you know, gardening, or whatever it may be that they're telling a story about. So I think that idea of storytelling, and sometimes storytelling as a subtle way to get folks to say, oh yeah, you know, I actually have observed some of these things that people are talking about.
I'll jump in.
Yeah,
I'll jump
Phyllis.
in and add another something else from the university. I'm semi-retired from the Institute for Advanced Study, which is affiliated with INE. Yes. And one project that is in its second year now is looking at indigenous knowledge about stewardship of the environment. And I think that much more will be heard about that as the years continue, but it's really looking at traditional ecological knowledge and the deep understanding of how to sustain the earth. And so I think there's a lot of hope there. A lot of indigenous scholars, young and old, are really kind of, I guess, reclaiming or being seen as experts in this field, and so I think that's a great source of hope for me and others.
Yes, and I just want to say that I think we may be getting to essentially a day of reckoning around our relationships with Native American communities, and I do have hope that even though there is still rampant structural racism and even individual racism towards Native American folks, there are increasing examples of the quote unquote experts, the traditional experts, understanding that the traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous communities is real, and it is something that we should certainly respect, we can learn from, and in doing that, we need to partner respectfully with communities, Native American communities, to not co-opt and, you know, commodify that knowledge, but to really lift their voices and, you know, make them, you know, the experts. And I have some hope that, you know, those folks in academia and in government that, you know, have been working to do really authentic community engagement and, you know, participatory research and things like that, will make some headway in bringing those voices to bear on policies and practices, you know, outside of the Native American community.
Absolutely. And one thing I'll just add, a number of Native American colleagues who are working in that project talk about, you know, very forcefully saying, please don't think of our knowledge or our practices as quaint.
Yes.
They're not quaint. They're authentic, as you said. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Quaint is erasure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have another question while we're on the subject of that kind of the intersection of the climate change movement with race and racism. You mentioned a couple times, particularly as you're talking about systemic and structural issues.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering about this moves slightly on from messaging for kids specifically, but we are a predominantly white congregation in a fairly affluent area, and you know, one of the critiques I often hear about the environmental movement is that this is an issue for folks who are comfortable or for wealthy people. It's a privileged issue to worry about. And within that, I hear the sort of critique of you're not fighting for your own well-being based on your race or other thing. And I think it's a justified critique. And we also need to take climate change seriously. I'm wondering, I imagine you've heard that critique, and how do we go about hearing and maybe even responding to that critique without being dismissive of racism or other big structural issues?
Brendan, can you say a little bit more about, there was a middle part in there that I'm trying to remember exactly how you said that I didn't quite catch, and now I'm forgetting. I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting how you phrased that. It had something to do with, oh shoot.
Well, I've often heard this. I guess I'm hearing it a little less more recently. I'm starting to see that the movement for environmental care and justice is starting to sync up with the movement for racial justice.
Yes,
specifically
absolutely.
along the lines that you mentioned, recognizing, lifting up that climate change overwhelmingly is caused by affluent and often more white or Eurocentric nations. And yet there is still sort of well, this is a privileged concern to have, or a privileged issue, or a white justice issue. What do we, if those messages are still lingering out there, what do we do with them? How do we respond in a way that's not dismissive, but rather connectional?
So I think there's a couple of things to know, which is sometimes we make assumptions that the environmental movement and climate change movements are only a white concern, and that people of color are not interested in this. That's not true. There's actually a lot of, if you really, you can go back in history, and then certainly, now concurrently, there are a lot of examples of organizations that are by and for different cultural groups that are about environmentalism or connectedness to nature. And while certainly I would say, just in pure numbers, whites have outnumbered people of color in this movement. We have been, I think, subjected to history storytelling that is just like in US history in school. There's so much that we were not taught from a non-white perspective. That's also true in what we know about the environmental movement. So we need to sort of put aside this idea that people of color have never been part of this. So that's one thing, and we need to own that it's our own, sort of, white culture and way of white storytelling and telling of the history that has suppressed the stories of people of color who have been actively involved and organizations of color who have been actively involved. That said, I think you're right that right now we are seeing much more of an emergence of more of those sorts of organizations, or more recognition that we need to be investing in them. We need to help create new ones, and we need to tie these topics together because they are part of a system. Regular environmental stuff, climate change, racism, health issues, housing issues, all sorts of things are all tied together. And it's like the fate of one is also, you know, causal of the fate of the other. And so hitching them together actually makes quite a bit of sense. Both because they are connected, but it's also and therefore leveraging, you know, action on one can actually help improve something in the other, but also because it really helps people, it's educational, it really helps people understand the ways that they are all interconnected. So I guess my point is I want to correct history a little bit, but I also want to challenge us to make sure that we are doing everything we can to lift up the voices and invest in the organizations that are by and for people of color, because the real, I think, knowledge of what the impacts are within those people and those organizations, and some of the most creative and frankly disruptive in a good way, you know, good trouble, ways of taking action are likely also, that knowledge is also residing in those communities.
Thank you, Kathy.
Mm-hmm. Phyllis, I saw that you also had a comment or a question in the chat about what are you hearing from university students and how are you working with them, especially at IONE? So one of the things that I think is hugely inspiring and a big benefit of my role, which is a relatively new role at the Institute on the Environment, I've only been there about a year and a half, is seeing what's going on with students. And students, from what I understand from folks at IONE who've been doing sustainability education for years and years, they are seeing youth come in with just an incredible amount of knowledge about climate change, you know, ecological knowledge. I would say just sort of innate systems thinking in a way, not formal, you know, understanding. Still need to be taught some of the formalities of systems thinking, but they get it intuitively better than in, you know, prior years. And they are pretty much on fire regarding issues of equity and justice, and are really pushing the faculty and the administration to take action to essentially catch up with them. It's one of the benefits of working in higher education. You know, young people keep you on your toes and keep you real. So this does actually give me quite a bit of hope that we are seeing young people coming in with just incredible motivation and incredible knowledge. At IONE, we are trying to really give them, I would say, and they already have leadership skills. I don't want to do that thing like, you know, make them into leaders, because they come in with leadership skills. We are trying to help them understand what those leadership skills are, help them deal with things like imposter syndrome and dealing with ageism, you know, sorts of ageism in the reverse, you know, discrimination against young people, helping them navigate those worlds. We're trying to help them build their communication skills, but, you know, recognizing that they are leaders now, and that we want to give them opportunities to strengthen those skills and outlets for, you know, practicing their leadership skills. So at Institute on the Environment, while we do some teaching that is, you know, I would say, you know, knowledge giving, we are much more about providing experiences that are strengthening of, you know, the characteristics and the knowledge that they already come in with. You know, internships and cohort-based programs and mentoring and, you know, scholarships to, you know, to help them get out into the community to really practice what they are learning in their classes, and providing them with community mentors and connections that will lead to, you know, future job opportunities. So we're trying to build pathways essentially from their passions, you know, into action in the world and future vocational and professional endeavors.
I have another question.
Sure, Judy.
What could we do as a church to help build the kind of caring and background that you just described with these kids that are coming to the university? What could we do in our own curriculum, or what we say from the pulpit, or any
Wow.
suggestions about that?
So you have youth in your congregation, I assume, that are probably involved in some sort of youth education or youth development programming through your church. Is that true?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm seeing some shaking of heads. Okay. I think the most important thing is to engage them in conversation about this topic, to understand where they're at and what they might be interested in doing. I think allowing them the power to make those decisions about where they want to put their energies is really important, because that's what I think enlivens the efficacy idea. When adults sort of, give them information or give them a project, that is adult determined, it's not as powerful as when the youth themselves make the decisions about what that's going to look like based on their own passions and things that they're most concerned about. And they have the decision-making power to bring this along with support, from adults. And, it may or may not be the most strategic thing that they could be working on, but it is one of the more strategic things that you can do, because it is providing them with a sense of their own power, and teaching the skills of collaboration, or giving them the opportunity to practice the skills of collaboration and communication and conflict, resolution, and taking leadership and those sorts of things. So I think something that you can really do is giving opportunities for building self-efficacy. That would be my message.
So
I would also, so go ahead, Judy.
I was just going to ask, these young people that you described who are coming in very motivated, do you know anything about their backgrounds and what was the basis for that evolution in them to be so committed? I mean, was it their families, the schools?
Yeah,
Where did that come from?
we haven't actually, looked at that in any kind of systematic sort of way. And of course, we have youth coming from all over the state, and there may be some differences in kids' backgrounds, whether they're the ones coming in on fire or not coming in on fire. I really don't know. But I think it's hard to be a young person right now and not be aware of and somehow emotionally impacted by what is happening all around us: fires and floods and hurricanes and massive immigration due to climate change. If you are at all aware and on social media, which they all are in one way or another, it's hard not to be aware. And then I think they also see people like Greta Thunberg, amazing role model, who is absolutely inspiring of this generation and all of us, I think. I see some of those students actually influencing their families. Sometimes they get involved with projects at IONE, and we have stories of them going back and convincing their families to put solar on their roofs, or that kind of thing. So I'm sure some kids are coming out of families where it's an aware and an activist sort of family culture, but we also have stories of it essentially being the reverse, that the student is the one who activates their family.
Great, thank you.
I'd love to just briefly add here too, for those of us who are parents or grandparents, signaling in some way to our young folks that we are allies and co-workers in this can be really important. I think
whether it's fair or not, that sort of stereotype of climate change is for younger people to figure out, or it's a younger people movement. That's not fair to the people in this room who I know take climate change and advocacy very seriously. But they hear that message, they receive that message, so they may need to hear from us something different. And it could be really powerful to just say, you know, we used to use this product, and then when we realized that's unhelpful for the earth, now we do this instead. And it's not about, you know, going on a full lecture, but just that little signal can be a way to say, I'm an ally in this. And that can help them know that, oh, I can talk with grandma or grandpa or with uncle this or uncle that about this. I know that they care about this. And so that's, you know, it's very tiny, but I think that can actually be a really helpful change for young people. Kathy, we need to wrap up here in order for our worship service. We'll thank you in a moment here, but I'm wondering if there's any last word that you'd like to share with our wider team.
Well, first, I just want to thank you for listening, for your interest in this topic, and you're obviously very engaged and, you know, concerned about young people and about you know, climate in our natural world. And thank you. You know, the more people like you, the better in the world. So I appreciate your attention, and I appreciate what you're trying to learn and what you're trying to do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathy. Let's, I'll invite everyone to unmute themselves so we can say a big thank you here to Kathy Jordan for joining us. And a reminder, Kathy put that wonderful, helpful link in the chat. I'll hold on to it, I'll save it so that if anyone is looking for it and can't find it, you can email me to find that later. But let's all say thank you to Kathy for joining us for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Kathy.
Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you.